I call Dennis O'Rourke.
Mr Speaker, it's a great pleasure for New Zealand First to be able to support this private bill with the impressive name Christian Churches New Zealand Property Trust Board Empowering Bill. And there's been a long history of trusts and legislation for the purpose of holding property for the Associated Churches of Christ in New Zealand. And other speakers have canvassed that history very accurately, and it's not necessary for me to do so again. Suffice it to say that originally the focus of the old trusts and legislation was on the holding of church property. That's what it was set up for, and that's what it did. Simply that, nothing much more, and it was very narrow in its focus. But obviously, over time, things change, and they have in this case. They change as a result of events which happen over many years, and also they change as a result in the changing of attitudes. And some of the events which drive change for issues like this are, for example, the two world wars would have changed people's attitudes and changed the focus of churches and what they were there to do and what needs they attempted to, for the community they attempted to carry out. And I know personally that in Christchurch, for example, where I live, the Canterbury earthquakes of 5 years ago have also been a driver of change as far as many of the churches in Christchurch are concerned, and because many of them were destroyed or damaged and have been since demolished as a result of the earthquake. And many of the churches have decided that they won't rebuild all of those churches and won't repair all of them, and instead will use the proceeds of insurance and the proceeds of sale of property for other purposes in order to meet their changing needs. So you can see that events do actually act as a driver for change, even in respect of issues like this for trusts which hold church property. And the other thing, as I've said, which drives change are attitudes and the needs of the congregations, because more and more churches have acted to meet the social needs and the educational needs and other needs, community needs of their congregations. So I feel that there's been quite a strong change over many years, less towards investment in property and more towards investment in those other social purposes. And I think that's a very good thing, because it reflects the needs of the people who rely on those churches for those purposes. So it's understandable then that this private bill is coming to us to seek changes which the Churches of Christ in New Zealand have asked us to look at, because it's pretty clear that the definition of the powers in the current legislation and the trusts set up under that are far too narrow for current needs, and something needs to change. So we need to solve those doubts, create more clarity, and to create wider powers for the trustees in order that they can do the new things that are required of them in this day and age. And it's pleasing to see that the Churches of Christ back in 2013 got together and decided what those needs were and what they wanted for an updated piece of legislation. And this bill is ultimately the outcome of that process. So the bill itself really only does two things, and one is to create a clear legal power for to enable the transfer of the property from the existing trusts to the new trusts to be established as a result of this legislation. And the second thing is to create broader powers for the trustees to do the new things that I've already spoken of earlier. And it will allow, as a result, the churches to consider a wider mission, not only in terms of buildings, but in use of their funds for the other activities of the churches so that they can do the things that they now wish to do. New Zealand First thoroughly approves of those two new purposes in this bill, and we wish the churches well in using their resources for those wider purposes. And the bill and the new trusts will allow the trustees to invest in different ways than they were empowered to do so in the past. We think that's very appropriate. And I'm also pleased to see that the Government Administration Select Committee has done a good job in listening to the two submissions it had and reviewing the fine detail of the bill, and to report that back to the House as they have done. So New Zealand First is very happy with the detail of the legislation and its purposes, and we will therefore be very pleased indeed to vote in favour of the bill.